Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a Puerto Rican moist cake, or as we call it, un bizcocho mojadito. But first, let's start with the ingredients that we're going to need. For the batter, we need 2 cups of sifted self-rising flour, 1.5 cups of sugar, 1 tablespoon of any flavoring, 2 bars of salted butter, and 6 eggs. We also need half a cup of sugar and 1 cup of water to make the simple syrup. And for the frosting, we need 1 tablespoon of almond extract, 2 pounds of powdered sugar, 1 cup of vegetable shortening, 1/4 cup of milk, and 2 bars of unsalted butter. The first thing we need to do is to separate the egg yolks from the egg whites, because we need to beat the egg whites separately. What I like to do is crack the eggs and with the help of the shell, separate them. You just need to be careful because the shells are sharp and can break the yolks like it happened to me right here. But the important part is that we don't get any of the egg yolks in the egg whites. There's even some tools out there in the market that easily separate the eggs, but trust me, you really don't need them. If it is easier for you, you could break each egg and put it in your hand and just let the whites run through your fingers until you only have the yolk left. And don't worry if you leave some of the egg whites attached to the yolks. Just make sure no yolks in your egg whites. Now we need to cream the 2 bars of salted butter with the sugar. Just make sure that the butter is at room temperature. If your butter is still cold or you forgot to take it out of your fridge, just pop it in the microwave for 10 seconds or until it's softened but not melted. Now add the butter and 1 cup of sugar to a big bowl. Beat it at high speed for 1 minute and then add half a cup more of the sugar you have left. Here I'm using a hand mixer, but this recipe can be made in a stand mixer. If you use a stand mixer, you can just put all the butter and the sugar at the same time. Now I'm using salted butter here, but you can also use unsalted or even margarine. This is just a taste preference. Now keep beating the sugar and the butter for about 10 minutes. This is how it should look. You'll know that it's ready when the butter has a pale color and the sugar has integrated and you can no longer see it. Now we have to add the egg yolks. I like to add the eggs one at a time so they can mix in well. But to tell you the truth, I think this is just a myth, because there's many people that add all the egg yolks at the same time and they swear that they get the same results. I have tried it and I really can't tell any difference, so feel free to do it however you want. You just have to make sure that the eggs are fully incorporated and you no longer see the yolks. Then, before adding any other ingredient, I like to scrape my bowl. It doesn't matter if you're using a hand or a stand mixer. Scrape the bowl and make sure everything is mixed in together. Then I like to add my flavoring. I use 1 tablespoon of almond extract, which is a very common flavor in Puerto Rican cakes. A flavor emulsion is what is typically used, but it's hard to find at a local supermarket. To get an emulsion, whatever flavor it is, you'll have to find it online or at shops where they sell bakery supplies. I'll link one down below. Then mix the almond extract for about 15 seconds. Then we need to add the flour little by little, because if we just dump the whole thing in, we'll be left with a lot of clumps of flour. Add about half a cup at a time. Make sure that your mixer is at a low speed so the flour doesn't fly everywhere and you end up with a big mess to clean. Every time you add flour, you need to mix it in just enough so most of the flour is combined. Your mix will still have some white spots and that's perfect. We do not want to overmix in this step because this is one of those things that can cause your cake to deflate after baking. By now your mix will look a little lumpy and a little dry, but you just have to trust the process. After adding all the flour, we want to scrape the bowl. Scraping the bowl will also help mix in the dry parts. Then set it aside for later. Now is a good time to preheat your oven to 325 degrees. Then we need a dry big bowl. Emphasis on the big bowl because my bowl wasn't big enough. We now need to beat the egg whites on high speed until you get stiff peaks. You will quickly notice how the egg whites start to change. They go from a clear liquid to a bubbly mix, and then after about 5 minutes is when you start to notice the change in color and texture. The whole process takes about 10 minutes. This is how it will look. If you flip the bowl, nothing should move or fall out. Then the next step is to mix the batter and the egg whites. But before you mix anything, I suggest you get a big bowl. Don't be like me and get yourself a big bowl because it will make the job easier. Now add about half of the batter to the egg whites and fold them in. Don't just mix. We need to fold them in because folding the batter makes sure that the air bubbles don't break and it makes a fluffier cake. Then what I like to do is to take a piece of parchment paper that is big enough to cover the bottom of my mold. I then fold the paper in half twice and then connect the corners to make a triangle. Then I measure so the tip of the paper is in the middle of the mold and cut it to size. Using parchment paper is not really necessary, but I always like to do it to make extra sure that my cake never sticks to the bottom of my mold. I then spray the mold with cooking spray, place the piece of parchment in, and spray a little more of the cooking spray. I then add all the batter to my mold. This is a 7x4 mold, and you can also use a 6x4 if you want a taller cake. I'll link both of the molds in the description below. After adding all the batter, what I like to do is softly tap my mold against my table to level the batter, and then we just have to bake it for 1 hour. But it's very important that you don't open the oven door until the cake is completely cooked, because this is one of the causes for a deflated cake. Then we want to make our simple syrup. In a small pan over high heat, add 1 cup of water and a half a cup of sugar. This you want to cook for about 5 minutes. Stir a couple of times to make sure all the sugar dissolves. Then what I like to do is transfer this simple syrup to a heat-resistant measuring cup to cool. After the cake is cooked, let it cool, and then we need to unmold it. I always like to run a knife through the border of the pan just in case anything is stuck to the mold. Then I take a big piece of plastic wrap to put my cake over. Now this is how your cake will look. Golden brown and very spongy. Then we take the cake by the plastic wrap to put it in the mold again. Here is where you get the mojadito part. We have to slowly pour the simple syrup all over the cake. This adds sweetness to the cake and it also makes it very moist. It is absolutely delicious. Think of it as a tres leches, but the liquid is not pouring out. It is just wet enough to be moist. Some bakers mimic this by, instead of using simple syrup, they'll use milk. There's always the question about whether if you need to add a hot simple syrup to a hot cake, or do you have to wait and add a cold syrup to a cold cake. But the answer is both. You could do it either way. I just like to do it while both things are cold, or at least warm but not hot. After pouring all the simple syrup, what I like to do is wrap the cake while in the mold. I'll do this so the cake doesn't absorb any odors while in the fridge. But before wrapping the cake, make sure that it has had time to cool down. You can cool it down at room temperature or cool it down in your fridge. While the cake cools, we can start making the frosting we're going to use. Of course, you don't need to use any frosting for this cake because it is really good on its own. You can also use any buttercream frosting you like for this recipe, but this is the typical frosting used in Puerto Rican cakes, which is a very stable buttercream for hot climates. To make the frosting, try to use a big bowl because it will make it so much easier. Then to the bowl, we add 2 bars of unsalted butter, and then we add 1 cup of vegetable shortening, and we mix this on high speed. This whole process is gonna take about 10 minutes. This recipe, it is so simple that even kids can make it. Always with the help of an adult, of course. You're going to start seeing how the butter changes color after about 5 minutes, and that's exactly what we want. We then add 1 tablespoon of flavoring. Right here, the one I'm using is almond extract. Then we mix again for about 1 minute. Remember that you could also use a flavor emulsion made for baked goods. We lower the speed to low, and then we start adding the powdered sugar. I like to add it little by little so the sugar can incorporate better. Remember that this recipe can be made in a stand mixer, but also it can be made with a hand mixer just like the one I'm using here. It's just that the stand mixer makes the job easier. After you have added about half of the sugar in, you need to scrape the bowl to make sure that everything on the side and the bottom of your bowl gets mixed in. Then we just keep on adding the sugar. The more you add, the harder it will feel to mix. Don't worry, just keep mixing, and after most of the sugar is incorporated, set your speed to high. Then what I like to do is add my milk little by little. Also, if you don't have any or you don't want to add any milk, you could substitute it for 1/4 cup of water. I add the milk a little bit at a time so it won't be splashing everywhere, and this way you can control the texture of the buttercream. That's why I only start by adding 1 tablespoon of milk, because I want to see the texture. Then we need to keep mixing this for a good 5 minutes. This will help to incorporate more air into the buttercream, making it very light and fluffy. The best part about this buttercream is that you can make it days ahead if you have time. Then cover the buttercream until you're ready to use. Once you're ready to frost the cake, we need to remove it from the mold. Here you'll see me pulling the plastic wrap to lift it, but I should have just flipped it over because it would have been way easier. Then place the cake in your cake pad or the plate that you're going to use. Then we need to fill our piping bag with the buttercream. Here I'm using a disposable frosting bag and I am using a Wilson's 6B piping tip. I am using this specific tip because I'm going for a very specific decoration, but this buttercream is good to use with any piping tip that you like. Then what we first need to do is to add about 1.5 to 2 cups of buttercream on top of the cake, and with the aid of a spatula we want to level it out. What we are trying to do is to give the cake what they call a crumb layer. This is supposed to trap all the crumbs so none of them will be visible in the final finish. But in my case, the reason for making a crumb layer is to avoid any gaps where you can see the cake between my piping. Then little by little I start adding buttercream to the side of the cake. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you see my frosting skills, they are not very good. I even have some gaps in between. But I didn't worry because all of this was going to be fixed using a dough scraper. With this tool, I even out all the buttercream and even filled any gaps I had. But if you don't have any of these, you could use any straight tool you have. Use a spatula or even the back of a knife. Or you could just stop here and use a spoon to finish decorating. Then we want to start piping. What I'm doing here is 1. Trying to pipe in a straight line going up. 2. I'm also trying to keep the same pressure so every time I pipe, I get a consistent size. Now, like I mentioned before, this is a Puerto Rican style cake, but we could say that this is how most of the Puerto Rican cakes used to look. Because nowadays, while you could still find cakes decorated like this, well, way better than this one, of course, most of the cakes you see nowadays have all types of pretty decorations with fancy pipings or decorated with fondant. But this right here is very nostalgic for me. This is how cakes were mainly decorated, one tip and one color all over with the same design. And this is how beautiful a Puerto Rican style cake looks. A delicious bizcocho mojadito. Great served next to a scoop of ice cream. Buen provecho. Thanks for watching.